The morning of February 23, 1945, broke gray and hostile over Iwo Jima. Hill 362 rose through volcanic haze like a monument to death itself. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams pressed his body against the black sand. 70 pounds of metal, fuel, and compressed gas pressed back against his spine. The weight seemed to grow heavier with each breath. Steel tanks cut into his shoulders through the canvas straps. His back ached from the constant pressure. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with aviation gasoline filled his nostrils. Every movement sent waves of pain through muscles, already pushed beyond endurance. Smoke drifted across the battlefield in thick gray clouds. Volcanic ash hung in the air like powder. Through this deadly haze, Williams could make out shapes that had once been men. His demolition unit lay scattered across the volcanic rock. 6 specialists who had trained together, 6 men who understood explosives and flame like others understood breathing. Now they were gone. Bodies twisted in unnatural positions. Some still moved weakly. Others had found the stillness that comes only with death. Blood mixed with black volcanic ash created a paste that stuck to everything it touched. 4 riflemen crouched behind whatever cover they could find. Their job was simple in theory. Provide covering fire while Williams moved forward. Keep Japanese defenders pinned down long enough for him to work. In practice, their task bordered on impossible. Machine gun nests covered every angle. Artillery positions commanded the high ground. Sniper holes dotted the landscape like deadly eyes. The concrete pillbox squatted ahead, like a gray tumor on the hillside. Its reinforced walls had stopped 3 entire Marine companies. Hundreds of men had tried to advance past this single position. Bodies marked their failure. The pillbox sat perfectly positioned to command the only route forward. Its machine guns swept the area with methodical precision. Inside Williams's flamethrower tanks, approximately 4 gallons of carefully mixed fuel waited for release. The liquid sloshed gently as he shifted position. Diesel oil provided the base. High-octane aviation gasoline added explosive power. Together they created a mixture that burned longer and hotter than any pure fuel could manage. 7 seconds. That was his window. 7 seconds of continuous burn time before the tanks ran dry. 7 seconds during which he would be completely exposed to enemy fire. 7 seconds marked by brilliant orange flame that would announce his position to every Japanese soldier within sight. The mathematics of death surrounded flamethrower operations. Military statisticians had calculated survival rates with cold precision. 7 seconds of burn time translated to roughly half the average combat lifespan of a Marine flamethrower operator. The numbers painted a grim picture of systematic destruction. Japanese machine gunners had learned to target the distinctive backpack configuration. The bright orange flame served as a perfect aiming point. Once an operator fired his weapon, every enemy soldier in the area knew exactly where death was approaching from. The operator became a magnet for concentrated fire from multiple positions. The casualty statistics told the brutal story of specialized warfare. Of the flamethrower operators deployed to Iwo Jima, 1 battalion sustained losses that defied comprehension. 92% casualty rate. Not wounded men who could return to duty. Not soldiers temporarily out of action. Casualties meant dead, missing, or so severely injured they would never see combat again. These were not random statistics. They represented individual men who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in Marine Corps history. Men who understood their chances and chose to carry fire into battle anyway. Men whose names would be forgotten, except by families who mourned them. This became the story of how America's most effective close-quarters weapon transformed into its most lethal assignment. How the tool that could crack Japanese defensive positions became a death sentence for the men who wielded it. How liquid fire became the key to victory and the guarantee of destruction for those who carried it. The weapon itself appeared deceptively straightforward in design. The M2 flamethrower, introduced in 1944, consisted of 3 cylindrical tanks mounted in a backpack frame. The configuration looked almost innocent to untrained eyes. Just metal cylinders and hoses arranged for portability. 2 larger tanks held the fuel mixture. Each tank contained approximately 2 gallons of the diesel and aviation gasoline combination. Engineers had spent months perfecting this mixture ratio. Pure gasoline burned too quickly. Straight diesel oil wouldn't ignite reliably. The combination provided the perfect balance of ignition speed and burn duration. Between the fuel tanks sat a smaller cylinder containing compressed nitrogen. This cylinder served as the heart of the weapon system. Nitrogen under 300 pounds per square inch of pressure would force fuel through the delivery system. The pressure had to be precise. Too little pressure, and the fuel wouldn't reach effective range. Too much pressure, and the system could rupture catastrophically. A flexible rubber hose connected the backpack assembly to the firing mechanism. This hose had to withstand enormous pressure while remaining flexible enough for combat maneuvering. The rubber composition was specially designed to resist heat damage from the flames it carried. Even so, the hose remained vulnerable to shrapnel and small arms fire. The firing wand looked like an oversized metal tube with a pistol grip. 2 triggers controlled the weapon's operation. The rear trigger released nitrogen pressure, forcing fuel through the system toward the nozzle. The front trigger activated the ignition system that would transform liquid fuel into liquid fire. 5 igniter cartridges arranged in a revolver-style configuration provided reliable spark ignition. Each cartridge functioned like a large pistol cartridge. When fired, it created an electric spark hot enough to ignite the fuel mixture even under adverse combat conditions. Rain, humidity, and battlefield debris could all interfere with ignition systems. The multiple cartridge design provided backup options when primary ignition failed. When fully loaded with fuel and propellant, the M2 weighed 70 pounds. This weight had to be carried across uneven terrain while under enemy fire. The operator couldn't simply drop the weapon and take cover. The backpack configuration meant the tanks had to be removed methodically. In combat situations, this took precious seconds the operator rarely possessed. Effective range measured approximately 20 meters under normal conditions. But combat conditions were never normal. Wind could alter the flame pattern. Humidity affected burn characteristics. Terrain features changed how the fuel mixture flowed and spread. Under ideal laboratory conditions, the flame could reach 40 meters. On Iwo Jima, ideal conditions existed only in training manuals. Total burn time lasted 7 to 8 seconds of continuous fire. Operators learned quickly to fire in controlled bursts rather than sustained streams. Each burst consumed roughly half a gallon per second. The math was unforgiving. 8 gallons of fuel mixture divided by half-gallon consumption rate equaled 16 seconds maximum if fired in single-second bursts. But combat rarely allowed such precise fuel management. Stress, adrenaline, and the desperate need to neutralize targets quickly led to longer bursts. Most operators exhausted their fuel supply in less than total rated burn time. Then they faced the dangerous process of returning to friendly lines for refueling, while enemy soldiers tried to kill them. Each burst created a rolling fireball of diesel-fueled flame that could penetrate small openings in fortifications. The flame would flow like liquid around corners and through connecting passages. Most critically, the burning fuel consumed oxygen needed for human survival within enclosed spaces. Japanese soldiers hiding in bunkers and caves faced death from multiple causes simultaneously. Direct contact with flame caused immediate burns that proved fatal within minutes. But even soldiers who avoided direct flame exposure faced suffocation, as burning fuel consumed all available oxygen in their confined spaces. The weapon killed through thermal injury, smoke inhalation, and asphyxiation. It transformed Japanese defensive positions into ovens that baked their occupants alive. The men who volunteered to carry these weapons of liquid fire understood danger in abstract terms during training. Combat would teach them the specific reality of walking into focused enemy fire while carrying tanks full of flammable fuel on their backs. Understanding and experiencing proved to be entirely different levels of knowledge. Private First Class Joseph Rybakiewicz had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1942. Pearl Harbor had shattered American illusions about distance and safety. The heroic stories emerging from Guadalcanal painted combat in romantic terms that glossed over the brutal realities of jungle warfare. Young men across America responded with patriotic fervor that would be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. After completing boot camp at Parris Island, Rybakiewicz could have remained stateside. The naval base in New London, Connecticut, needed guards for the duration of the war. Safe duty that would have kept him alive and whole. Instead, he listened to combat stories from Marines rotating back from Pacific campaigns. Their tales of brotherhood and purpose convinced him to request combat assignment. His path led to the demolition and flamethrower school at Camp Lejeune in July 1944. Training proved brutally technical from the first day. Instructors taught mechanical operation with the precision of engineers. Students learned to prime ignition systems under time pressure. They practiced maintaining proper nitrogen pressure while under simulated fire. Detecting fuel leaks became a matter of life and death. A small leak could turn the operator into a human torch if flame contacted spilled fuel. Students learned to inspect every connection before each mission. They memorized the smell of different fuel mixtures. They developed instincts about pressure variations that could indicate system failure. Proper firing stance required specific body positioning to counteract the weapon's recoil. When compressed nitrogen exploded through the system, it created substantial kickback force. Unless the operator braced correctly and leaned into the discharge, the barrel could point skyward, raining burning fuel down onto the operator himself. Woody Williams remembered the learning process with vivid clarity. He couldn't count the number of times he singed off eyebrows and arm hair while mastering weapon control. The propellant force created substantial kick when fired. Students who failed to maintain proper stance found themselves covered in their own burning fuel. Williams witnessed one Marine, untrained but desperate, pick up a fallen flamethrower and fire it without proper preparation. The man was saturated with flame within seconds. His screams lasted longer than his life. The lesson burned itself into every student's memory. Technique wasn't optional when dealing with liquid fire, but technical proficiency represented only the foundation. Real training involved understanding tactical employment. Students learned how to approach fortified positions while minimizing exposure time. They practiced coordinating with rifle squads, providing suppressing fire. Most critically, they learned how to survive long enough to engage their targets. Training emphasized that flamethrower operators never worked alone in combat. Standard doctrine called for 4 to 6-man fire teams. The flamethrower operator and assistant carried primary and backup equipment. The assistant hauled extra fuel cylinders and ignition cartridges. His job included reloading duties and taking over if the primary operator was hit. At least 2 riflemen, preferably armed with Browning automatic rifles, provided suppressing fire during approaches to enemy positions. Their job was to keep Japanese defenders pinned down while the flamethrower team maneuvered into effective range. In theory, riflemen would maintain continuous fire on target apertures, preventing enemy soldiers from exposing themselves to return fire. The assistant would help reload equipment or assume operator duties if casualties occurred. It was sound tactical doctrine developed through analysis of previous island campaigns. On Iwo Jima, it rarely functioned as planned. Reality had ways of destroying the most carefully crafted military theories. Corporal Williams and Private Rybakiewicz were individual components of a much larger story. Their personal experiences reflected a strategic nightmare that began not with American planning, but with Japanese determination to make victory as costly as possible. The architect of this defensive masterpiece was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Kuribayashi came from samurai lineage that traced back centuries. Career military service had shaped his understanding of warfare and honor. But unlike many Japanese commanders who viewed Americans through the lens of racial prejudice and cultural superiority, Kuribayashi possessed first-hand knowledge of his enemy's capabilities. During the 1920s, he had spent time in the United States training with cavalry units at Fort Bliss, Texas. This experience provided insights that most Japanese officers lacked. He had observed American industrial capacity firsthand. He had trained alongside American soldiers and officers. He had seen the energy and versatility that characterized American military culture. Kuribayashi had written letters to his wife, describing Americans in terms that contradicted official Japanese propaganda. The United States was the last country Japan should fight, he warned. American industrial capacity was huge and fabulous. The people possessed energy and versatility that made them formidable opponents. American fighting ability should never be underestimated under any circumstances. In May 1944, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo personally assigned Kuribayashi to defend Iwo Jima. The general understood his strategic situation with brutal clarity. He couldn't win a conventional victory against American forces, but he could make victory so expensive in American lives that the United States might reconsider plans for invading the Japanese mainland. Every American death on Iwo Jima would influence public opinion back home. Every week of prolonged resistance would delay subsequent operations. Every casualty would force American planners to recalculate the costs of final victory. Kuribayashi's mission was to make the mathematics of war work in Japan's favor through sheer defensive determination. Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944 and immediately began transforming the volcanic island into the most formidable defensive position constructed during the Pacific War. His approach broke fundamentally with traditional Japanese military doctrine that emphasized offensive action and spiritual superiority over material considerations. Instead of defending the beaches and attempting to push invaders back into the sea, he would let them land unopposed. Rather than launching suicidal banzai charges that wasted men for minimal tactical gain, he would husband his forces for maximum defensive impact. Every soldier would be positioned to inflict maximum casualties on attacking Americans. His defensive strategy was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implementation. Inflict maximum casualties through defense in depth. Maintain protracted resistance that would drain American resources and morale. Coordinate firepower from mutually supporting positions that could not be destroyed by naval bombardment or aerial attack. To achieve this vision, Kuribayashi mobilized his 23,000-man garrison in the most ambitious engineering project the Japanese military had undertaken. 25% of his entire force was dedicated full-time to construction and tunneling operations. Combat soldiers became construction workers, wielding picks and shovels instead of rifles and bayonets. Mining engineers were brought from Japan specifically to design an underground fortress that would be virtually immune to bombardment. These specialists understood rock formations and excavation techniques that combat engineers lacked. They planned tunnel networks with the precision of subway systems. The island's volcanic rock consisted of soft pumice layers alternating with harder basalt formations. Pumice could be carved with hand tools in many areas, allowing rapid excavation of chambers and connecting passages. Where the rock proved too hard, construction crews used explosives and pneumatic drills brought from Japanese industrial sites. Over 8 months of continuous work, Japanese engineers carved more than 11 miles of tunnels into Iwo Jima's volcanic foundation. The tunnel network extended as deep as 75 feet below the surface, creating a three-dimensional fortress that existed almost entirely underground. Surface positions served mainly as firing points, connected to the real fortress hidden beneath. The tunnel network demonstrated sophisticated military engineering that impressed even American observers after the battle. Major chambers capable of holding 300 to 400 men served multiple functions. Underground barracks provided sleeping space protected from bombardment. Command posts allowed coordination of defensive operations. Storage facilities held ammunition, food, and water supplies needed for extended resistance. Smaller caves accommodated only 2 or 3 soldiers, but served as individual fighting positions. These connected to the larger tunnel system, allowing rapid movement between locations. Defenders could retreat when a position became untenable, then reoccupy it after American forces moved past. They could reinforce threatened areas by moving underground invisible to American observation. Ventilation shafts provided fresh air circulation throughout the network, though sulfurous volcanic fumes required special attention in many areas. Multiple entrances and exits ensured that troops wouldn't be trapped if any single entrance was destroyed by bombardment. The system incorporated redundancy that made it nearly impossible to seal completely. The Nanpo bunker housed naval headquarters 90 feet underground, with concrete walls thick enough to withstand direct hits from battleship guns. Supply chambers contained enough food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies to sustain the garrison for 3 months of siege conditions. This wasn't a defensive position built for quick victory or defeat. It was designed for prolonged resistance. Above ground, Kuribayashi's engineers constructed over 600 concrete pillboxes and blockhouses. These weren't hastily improvised fighting holes dug by infantry soldiers. They were reinforced concrete fortifications with walls 4 feet thick, designed by engineers who understood structural loads and blast resistance. Each pillbox was positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire with neighboring positions. If Marines approached one pillbox, they would automatically come under fire from adjacent positions. No single fortification could be attacked in isolation. Every approach brought attackers under observation and fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Japanese engineers installed firing ports that allowed machine gunners to engage targets while remaining almost completely protected from return fire. The apertures were designed to provide maximum fields of fire while presenting minimal targets for American weapons. Defenders could fire through narrow slits while remaining invisible to attackers trying to locate the source of incoming fire. Camouflage techniques made positions nearly invisible until they opened fire. Volcanic ash and native scrub vegetation disguised concrete structures until they blended seamlessly with natural terrain features. American aerial reconnaissance photographs failed to identify most positions despite intensive study by intelligence specialists. Defensive weapons were positioned to cover beaches, both operational airfields and every natural approach route across the island. No area of Iwo Jima would be safe from Japanese defensive fire. Americans would face constant danger from the moment they landed until the last position was eliminated. The defensive armament reflected months of careful planning and stockpiling. Kuribayashi's garrison possessed approximately 300 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers. 120 large naval guns ranging from 4.7-inch to 6-inch weapons provided long-range fire support. 438 artillery pieces of different types could concentrate fire on any target area. 69 anti-tank guns were positioned to engage American armor attempting to support infantry operations. 23 tanks provided mobile firepower, though most were eventually positioned in static defensive roles. The Japanese had stockpiled 22 million rounds of small-caliber ammunition, ensuring that defensive fire could be sustained throughout a prolonged battle. Hundreds of sniper nests and camouflaged machine gun positions covered virtually every square yard of terrain that offered concealment or fields of fire. Japanese marksmen had studied American tactics from previous island battles. They understood how American forces operated and positioned themselves accordingly. Among the most terrifying weapons were 320mm spigot mortars that fired massive projectiles high into the air before plunging down with devastating fragmentation effects. These weapons could engage targets in defilade that conventional artillery couldn't reach. Their high-angle fire made no location truly safe from attack. Kuribayashi had engineered his defensive network so that every square meter of Iwo Jima was subject to Japanese defensive fire from multiple positions. There would be no safe areas for attacking Marines to regroup or resupply, no rear areas where wounded could be evacuated without continuing danger. The entire island had become a killing ground, designed with methodical precision. The strategic importance of this 8-square-mile volcanic island lay in its geographic position relative to ongoing American bombing campaigns against Japan. Iwo Jima sat almost exactly halfway between American air bases in the Mariana Islands and Tokyo, approximately 750 miles from each location. 2 operational airfields with a third under construction made the island valuable real estate for both sides. For the Japanese, it served as an early warning station that could radio reports of incoming BT-9 bomber formations back to home island air defenses. This advance warning gave Japanese fighter squadrons time to prepare interception missions. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima harassed American bomber formations en route to targets in Japan. They couldn't stop the bombing campaigns, but they could inflict casualties on bomber crews and force alterations in flight patterns that reduced bombing effectiveness. Every American bomber shot down represented millions of dollars in equipment and months of crew training lost. For Americans, capturing Iwo Jima would eliminate this threat while providing valuable operational advantages. Fighter escorts based on the island could protect B-29 formations all the way to Japanese cities. An emergency landing field would save damaged bombers that couldn't make the long flight back to bases in the Marianas. The strategic calculus seemed straightforward to American planners. The human cost would prove almost incalculable in ways that no one fully anticipated before the battle began. American planning for Operation Detachment began in September 1944 with the assumption that Japanese resistance would follow patterns established in previous island campaigns. Intelligence officers studied aerial reconnaissance photographs and analyzed Japanese defensive techniques from earlier battles. Their estimates proved catastrophically optimistic. The Marines would provide the assault force consisting of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, totaling approximately 70,000 Marines and attached Navy personnel. These were veteran units with combat experience from previous Pacific operations. Their training and equipment represented the finest amphibious assault capability in the world. Supporting the Marine assault would be the largest fleet yet assembled in the Pacific theater. Approximately 450 ships, including 12 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, and countless cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels. This represented overwhelming firepower advantage that should have guaranteed swift victory. Lieutenant General Holland Smith commanded the 5th Amphibious Corps and understood the tactical difficulties ahead better than most planners. Intelligence officers had analyzed reconnaissance photographs with careful attention to detail. They had studied Japanese defensive tactics from previous island battles, including Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam. Smith requested 10 consecutive days of naval bombardment prior to the landing to soften Japanese defenses sufficiently for the assault to succeed. Prolonged bombardment had proven essential in previous operations, where shorter preparatory fires had resulted in heavy casualties during initial landings. He was granted only 3 days of preliminary bombardment. This decision was driven by Admiral Nimitz's tight operational schedule for subsequent operations, including the planned invasion of Okinawa. Time constraints took precedence over tactical considerations in ways that would cost thousands of Marine lives. The preliminary bombardment began on February 16, 1945, with the largest concentration of naval firepower yet assembled against a single target. For 3 consecutive days, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded Iwo Jima with thousands of shells, while carrier aircraft bombed and strafed identified targets across the island. It represented an impressive display of American industrial and military power. Observers described the bombardment as the most intensive in Pacific War history. Shells fell continuously on Japanese positions, while aircraft attacked in coordinated waves. The noise was audible from hundreds of miles away, but the bombardment proved largely ineffective against Japanese defensive preparations. Underground positions remained immune to surface bombardment, regardless of caliber or duration. Reinforced concrete pillboxes could withstand everything except direct hits from the largest naval guns firing armor-piercing shells. Craters created by the bombardment would actually provide additional cover for Japanese defenders, while creating obstacles for attacking Marines and their supporting vehicles. Many defensive positions remained completely undamaged because their camouflage proved so effective that American observers never identified them as targets. February 19, 1945, dawned gray and cold over the volcanic island that would consume so many American lives. At 0900 hours, the first wave of Marines landed on the southeastern beaches of Iwo Jima, expecting to encounter the familiar pattern of fierce resistance at the water's edge, followed by gradual advances inland. Instead, they encountered an unexpected obstacle immediately upon landing. The beach wasn't composed of sand like most Pacific islands. It consisted entirely of volcanic ash, arranged in steep terraces of soft gray pumice that provided no secure footing for men or vehicles. Marines sank to their ankles with every step they attempted. Tracked vehicles bogged down in the loose material. Tanks struggled to climb 15-foot terraces that collapsed under their weight. The volcanic terrain that should have provided defensive positions for attacking forces instead became an additional obstacle to overcome. Marines attempting to dig foxholes found the loose ash collapsing back into any excavation they managed to scrape out. The volcanic debris was so fine it clogged weapons mechanisms, jammed mechanical systems, and infiltrated every piece of equipment brought ashore. Even water supplies became contaminated with the pervasive gray powder. For the first hour, there was almost no enemy fire directed at the landing forces. This seemed to confirm optimistic intelligence estimates about Japanese defensive capabilities. Some Marines began to believe the preliminary bombardment had been more effective than expected. Kuribayashi's defensive plan was unfolding with perfect precision. He allowed Marines to land completely unopposed. He watched them struggle up the beaches, hampered by terrain difficulties. He waited until approximately 30,000 Marines were ashore, packed into a beachhead barely 1,000 yards deep, with follow-on waves still arriving. Then he opened fire with every weapon at his disposal. The result was catastrophic beyond anything American forces had experienced in previous Pacific campaigns. Artillery mortars and machine guns opened fire simultaneously from positions across the entire island. Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano dominating the southern end of Iwo Jima, erupted with muzzle flashes from dozens of hidden weapon positions. The high ground to the north, bristling with artillery and mortar positions, poured shells into the packed beaches, where Marines had no room to maneuver or take effective cover. Marines died by the hundreds in the first hour of sustained defensive fire. The loose volcanic terrain that had hindered their advance now became a death trap. The pumice was too soft to dig into for cover, yet too unstable to allow rapid movement under fire. Tracked vehicles and tanks desperately needed to break the tactical stalemate struggled to get off the beaches. Some were destroyed by artillery before they could maneuver into fighting positions. Others bogged down in volcanic ash and became stationary targets. Private First Class James Norton, part of the 3rd Battalion, 28th Marines. 5th Division remembered the terror of those first hours with vivid clarity years later. Nobody talked as they approached the beach in their landing craft. God only knew what was waiting ahead of them. The optimistic intelligence estimates that had predicted light resistance and quick victory evaporated in the first hours of sustained combat. By nightfall on D-Day, the Marines had managed to carve out precarious footholds on the southern end of the island. But the cost had been enormous beyond anything experienced in previous Pacific operations. Over 519 Marines killed in action, and more than 2,400 total casualties. This represented just the beginning of 5 weeks of the most brutal close-quarters combat in Marine Corps history. Flamethrower operators landed with their units on D-Day, though most weren't committed to combat operations immediately. The initial assault focused on securing the beachhead and establishing supply lines for sustained operations. Conventional weapons seemed adequate for the first phase of operations, but by D+2 February 21st, it became clear that conventional infantry weapons were insufficient against Japanese defensive positions. The fortifications were too well constructed, too expertly camouflaged, and too mutually supporting to be reduced by rifle fire and hand grenades alone. Artillery and naval bombardment could destroy some surface positions but proved useless against the tunnel networks that formed the backbone of Japanese resistance. Infantry assaults without specialized weapons resulted in horrific casualties for minimal territorial gains. Marines needed their demolition engineers and flamethrower operators to crack the defensive system. Corporal Williams landed on February 21st with advance elements of the 3rd Marine Division. His official job title was Demolition Sergeant, but his primary weapon was the M2 flamethrower that would make him famous. He supervised a 6-man flamethrower and demolition unit consisting of specialists trained to approach and destroy fortified positions using combinations of explosives and liquid fire. By the time Williams reached Iwo Jima, he had already seen combat on Guam, where he first learned how effective and how dangerous flamethrowers could be against Japanese fortifications. Japanese defensive tactics on Guam had provided valuable lessons about coordinated resistance and mutual fire support. But nothing Williams had experienced on Guam prepared him for the defensive sophistication and sheer determination of Japanese forces on Iwo Jima. The scale of fortification and the intensity of resistance exceeded anything American forces had previously encountered in Pacific operations. Marine doctrine for employing flamethrowers was straightforward in theory, though complex in execution. When Marines encountered fortified positions that stopped their advance, they would call for specialized support. Flamethrower teams represented the most effective solution for reducing hardened defensive positions that resisted conventional weapons. Riflemen typically armed with M1 Garand rifles and Browning automatic rifles would establish a base of fire. Their job was to pour suppressing fire into target pillboxes or cave entrances to prevent defenders from exposing themselves to return accurate fire. This covering fire had to be continuous and effective to give flamethrower operators any chance of survival. Under this protective fire umbrella, the flamethrower operator, accompanied by his assistant and additional riflemen, would advance as close as possible to the target position. Distance was critical because the weapon's effective range was limited to approximately 20 meters. Closer approach increased effectiveness, but also increased vulnerability to enemy fire. Once within effective range, the operator would engage the target, firing burst after burst of flaming fuel into openings until he had exhausted his fuel supply or neutralized all enemy resistance. Each engagement required precise timing and coordination between multiple Marines working as a team. Reality on Iwo Jima deviated catastrophically from this doctrinal framework in ways that cost hundreds of Marine lives. The Japanese defensive network meant that Marines couldn't suppress one position without immediately coming under fire from adjacent positions. Interlocking fields of fire made it nearly impossible to approach any single pillbox safely. Japanese snipers positioned in elevated locations throughout the defensive zone specifically targeted flamethrower operators. The distinctive backpack configuration made operators easy to identify at long range. The bright orange flame, visible for hundreds of meters, acted as a perfect aiming beacon once an operator engaged his target. The operator couldn't move quickly while firing his weapon. The system's weight, the need to aim carefully, and the resistance of the hose, connecting backpack to firing wand, all slowed movement to a crawl. The operator was essentially stationary while engaging targets, presenting an ideal target for concentrated enemy fire. The backpack itself represented a critical vulnerability that Japanese soldiers learned to exploit. Though the steel tanks were thick and reportedly bulletproof under most circumstances, they weren't completely invulnerable to all weapons. A direct hit from large-caliber weapons could puncture fuel tanks with catastrophic results. The nitrogen tank, operating under 300 pounds of pressure, could rupture from concussion or shrapnel impact. If the nitrogen tank failed while the operator was firing, the sudden loss of pressure could cause violent blowback through the system. If a fuel tank was punctured while the operator was firing and flame was already present, the result was immediate immolation. Japanese soldiers understood these vulnerabilities and aimed accordingly. They had studied American flamethrower tactics from previous battles. They knew exactly where to aim for maximum effect. They concentrated fire on the backpack assembly rather than the operator himself. The psychological burden was immense beyond anything experienced by other combat specialists. Flamethrower operators were priority targets for every enemy soldier who could see them. The moment they engaged a target, they would draw concentrated fire from every Japanese position within range. Their chances of survival decreased dramatically with each mission they undertook. The nature of their weapon made surrender impossible if they were wounded or trapped. Japanese soldiers who saw flamethrower operators approaching their positions understood they faced death by fire. They fought with the desperate determination of men who had absolutely nothing to lose. Some would attempt banzai charges against operators before they could engage. Others would hold fire until operators were completely vulnerable, then open fire with everything available. On February 23rd, 4 days into the battle that would consume over 6,000 American lives, Woody Williams found himself in the situation every flamethrower operator dreaded most. His company had been attempting to advance across one of the island's two operational airfields, but had been pinned down by intense fire from multiple Japanese pillboxes. 3 companies had already attempted to cross the open ground. All had been stopped with heavy casualties that littered the airfield with Marine bodies. Marine tanks had tried to support the advance, but were knocked out or driven back by Japanese anti-tank guns and artillery fire concentrated on the open terrain. The battalion commander called an emergency meeting in a shell crater to avoid Japanese observation from elevated positions. He asked Williams, as the only flamethrower and demolition expert still operational, if he would take on the pillbox positions that were stopping the entire advance. Williams understood the odds with brutal clarity. All other members of his flamethrower and demolition unit were already casualties. He would be working essentially alone against multiple hardened positions, but he also knew that without those pillboxes neutralized, his entire company would remain pinned down, taking casualties from machine gun and artillery fire, with no way to advance or retreat safely. He selected 4 riflemen to provide covering fire during his assault. Their job was nearly impossible under the circumstances. They had to suppress multiple Japanese positions while Williams maneuvered within effective range of his targets. 2 of those 4 riflemen would not survive the afternoon that followed. What Williams accomplished over the next 4 hours was later described in his Medal of Honor citation as the most conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. But the citation could barely capture the reality of what happened during those 4 hours of sustained combat against overwhelming odds. Williams crawled forward toward the first pillbox, with his 70-pound flamethrower dragging through volcanic ash that clung to everything. Bullets from Japanese machine guns ricocheted off his fuel tanks, sending sparks flying, but the thick steel construction held under impact. He managed to close within 25 yards and fired a massive ball of flame into the pillbox entrance, silencing the position permanently. He crawled toward the next defensive position and spotted wisps of smoke escaping from a ventilation hole cut into the reinforced concrete roof. Williams climbed on top of the fortification and fired his flamethrower nozzle directly into the ventilation opening, killing everyone inside through flame and asphyxiation. Over the course of 4 hours, Williams returned to his own lines 5 separate times to refill his flamethrower tanks with fresh fuel and obtain additional ignition cartridges. 5 times he moved back into completely open terrain under concentrated fire to engage more defensive positions. Each trip became more dangerous as Japanese defenders learned his pattern and concentrated fire accordingly. During one approach, Williams faced Japanese soldiers charging directly at him with bayonets fixed, attempting to kill him before he could bring his weapon to bear. Williams engaged them with flame from point-blank range. The flamethrower consumed all available oxygen as it created its fireball, asphyxiating the charging soldiers instantly, even before the flame could touch them. At another critical moment, Williams found himself under fire from 3 different directions simultaneously. He had no choice but to continue moving forward, because stopping would have meant certain death. The covering fire from his riflemen reduced from 4 to 3, then to 2, as casualties mounted, but barely kept Japanese defenders suppressed long enough for Williams to engage each position successfully. When the action was over, Williams had single-handedly destroyed 7 major pillboxes that had stopped 3 Marine companies cold for hours. He had consumed dozens of gallons of flamethrower fuel. He had survived multiple wounds that would earn him a Purple Heart. And he had demonstrated why flamethrower operators, despite their 92% casualty rate, were considered the most valuable specialists on Iwo Jima. Williams's experience, while extraordinary in its success, was entirely typical in terms of danger and exposure. Private First Class Joseph Rybakiewicz faced similar circumstances repeatedly during his 30 days of continuous combat on Iwo Jima. Each engagement represented a separate nightmare of exposure, concentrated fire, and counterfire. Rybakiewicz had carried 90 pounds of equipment, including his flamethrower and ammunition, when he hit the beach on February 21st. His first combat action was to fall face-first into volcanic ash and vomit from seasickness. Then he engaged the enemy for 30 consecutive days of the most intensive combat imaginable. Over the following month, Rybakiewicz would destroy 7 pillboxes and cave positions. Each engagement represented a separate story of courage and survival against overwhelming odds. On March 8th, Rybakiewicz's unit was advancing through a narrow gully when they encountered a pillbox positioned on elevated ground above their route. Before they could withdraw from the confined space, 4 Marines were killed and 5 wounded by concentrated machine gun fire that swept the gully like a deadly broom. Rybakiewicz provided first aid to 2 wounded men under continuing fire, then somehow managed to carry them back to the aid station, while Japanese soldiers tried to kill all 3 of them. A hand grenade exploded nearby, sending shrapnel scraping across his knuckles. Rybakiewicz didn't think the wound was serious enough to report to medical personnel. He returned immediately to the fighting position, asked a nearby Browning automatic rifle gunner to provide covering fire, and advanced with his flamethrower toward the pillbox that had caused the casualties. Fury consumed him as he watched his comrades fall in that deadly narrow corridor. Blood pooled where his friends had stood moments before. Wounded Marines cried out in pain. The sight ignited something primal inside him. He pushed forward through the chaos. His flamethrower roared to life. Orange fire erupted from the nozzle. The pillbox became his target. He described it later as giving the enemy position a long, squared burst. Flames poured through the concrete opening. The structure became an inferno within seconds. Everything inside burned completely. The position was neutralized. His mission was accomplished. But victory came with a price. The following morning brought medical attention. A doctor examined his bloodied hand with clinical precision. The wound was significant enough for evacuation. Treatment became necessary. The medical staff wrapped his hand in clean white bandages. First aid was administered with military efficiency. But the reprieve was temporary. Rybakiewicz found himself heading back to the front lines. The return journey filled him with dread. This moment haunted him more than any other. The realization struck him like a physical blow. He would face identical dangers again. The same deadly game would continue. Each day would bring fresh threats. Death could claim him at any moment. The cycle would persist until either he died or the battle ended. No other outcomes existed. Mathematical brutality defined the fate of flamethrower operators. Multiple factors combined to create devastating casualty rates. Each element worked against survival in calculated ways. The first factor was simple arithmetic of close-range engagement. Effective weapon use demanded proximity to enemy positions. 20 meters represented maximum useful distance. At such ranges, even poor marksmen rarely missed their targets. Japanese defenders proved far more accurate than American propaganda suggested. Their reputation for poor shooting was completely false. Iwo Jima shattered that myth permanently. Thousands of Marines died learning this truth. Enemy soldiers demonstrated devastating precision with their weapons. Close-quarters combat favored the defenders who knew every angle and distance. The second factor involved conspicuousness during operations. Orange flame created a beacon visible across entire battlefields. Smoke from burning positions marked operator locations with perfect accuracy. Even between firing sequences, the distinctive backpack silhouette identified priority targets. Enemy soldiers could spot flamethrower operators from remarkable distances. The bulky equipment made concealment nearly impossible. Camouflage became meaningless when your weapon announced your presence. Every movement drew concentrated enemy fire. Third was the cruel limitation of operational duration. 7 to 8 seconds of total burn time represented the complete fuel supply. Every burst had to achieve maximum effect. Short bursts still produced telltale flame signatures. Most targets required multiple engagements to neutralize completely. This meant multiple exposures to enemy fire. Each burst created another opportunity for death. Operators faced repeated moments of extreme vulnerability. The weapon demanded sustained exposure under direct fire. Fourth was the devastating mobility penalty. A Marine rifleman could move with lethal speed. The M1 Garand and basic combat load allowed sprinting. Diving for cover was instantaneous. Zigzag patterns confused enemy aim. Agility meant survival. Flamethrower operators carried 70 pounds of steel tanks. The weight was distributed awkwardly across their backs. Rubber hoses connected tanks to firing mechanisms. Movement became labored and deliberate. Quick reactions were impossible. Throwing oneself prone risked equipment damage. Sprinting threw off balance dangerously. Accurate firing while moving was completely impossible. Operators had to advance slowly and deliberately. They remained vulnerable far longer than any rifleman would dare. Speed was their enemy as much as Japanese fire. Fifth was the psychology of enemy targeting. Japanese soldiers understood flamethrower capabilities intimately. Artillery bombardment was terrifying, but often ineffective against underground positions. Naval gunfire was devastating, but couldn't reach deep tunnels. Rifle fire and grenades could be endured in fortified positions, but flame flowing into confined spaces created unbearable death. Oxygen disappeared instantly. Heat became lethal within seconds. There was no escape from flowing fire. Japanese defenders reserved special hatred for flamethrower operators. Killing them became a priority mission. Every enemy soldier understood the threat they represented. The sixth factor was statistical inevitability. Every engagement carried approximately equal risk levels. Cumulative probability worked against survival over time. An operator might survive one mission through luck and skill. 5 missions were possible. 10 missions pushed probability to breaking points. Over weeks of continuous combat, the mathematics became unforgiving. Dozens of position engagements meant dozens of life or death moments. Statistical probability of taking hits approached mathematical certainty. Survival became increasingly unlikely with each passing day. Military statisticians calculated average combat lifespans carefully. The 4-minute figure wasn't measuring single engagements. It represented cumulative exposure time across multiple missions. The clock started ticking with the first burst of flame. It stopped when the operator became a casualty. Few clocks ran very long. The 7th factor involved friendly fire risks. Marine artillery provided essential support for infantry assaults. Naval bombardment softened Japanese positions before attacks. Close air support was crucial for mission success, but these supporting fires created tremendous danger for nearby troops. Flamethrower operators worked closer to enemy positions than anyone else. Short artillery rounds killed Americans as efficiently as Japanese shells. Naval shells landing slightly off target obliterated entire squads. Danger-close fire missions were necessary, but deadly. When Marines requested supporting fires within minimum safe distances, they accepted calculated risks. Flamethrower operators working within meters of enemy positions existed in constant friendly fire danger zones. Death could come from behind as easily as ahead. Corporal Edgar Anthony's death illustrated the random horror perfectly. March 3rd found him serving with Company K of the 3rd Battalion. He was part of the 26th Marines in the 5th Marine Division. His flamethrower was loaded and ready for action. He was carrying the weapon forward when disaster struck. A Japanese sniper's bullet found its target. The round struck the fuel tanks mounted on Anthony's back. Impact caused catastrophic fuel leakage immediately. Diesel and aviation gas mixture drenched Anthony completely. The liquid soaked through his uniform. Fumes filled the air around him. A split second later, the weapon's igniter sparked. Anthony was engulfed in flame instantaneously. Fire consumed him in front of his entire squad. He burned to death while his comrades watched helplessly. His death was initially classified as missing in action. His body was burned beyond battlefield identification. Dental records later confirmed his identity. He was eventually interred at Manila American Cemetery. Anthony would have celebrated his 23rd birthday in April. He never made it off Iwo Jima. His death haunted everyone who witnessed it. The randomness was almost worse than the horror. Flamethrower tank introduction represented attempts to reduce operator casualties. Armor protection seemed like an obvious solution. The M4A3R3 Zippo tank was named after the popular cigarette lighter. It was a standard Sherman tank with modifications. The main gun was replaced with large-capacity flamethrower systems. Navy construction battalions worked at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. Colonel Unmacht supervised the development program. They created the CBH-1 and improved CBH-2 flamethrower systems. These could be mounted on Sherman tank chassis. Mechanized flamethrowers operated at 300 pounds per square inch pressure. This provided 400-foot effective range. The distance was dramatically longer than man-portable M2 units. Tank armor protected crews from small arms fire and most artillery fragments. Fuel capacity was vastly superior. 300 gallons compared to the M2's 4-gallon capacity. The tanks could sustain fire for extended periods. They could maneuver under direct enemy fire. Most importantly, they didn't expose vulnerable human operators to the same degree as portable units. 8 flamethrower tanks landed on Iwo Jima on D-Day, February 19th. They weren't committed to action until D+2. Commanders were initially uncertain about their battlefield effectiveness. Caution delayed their deployment unnecessarily. But once committed to combat, they proved devastatingly effective. Zippo tanks could approach pillboxes that would be suicide missions for infantry. They could pour hundreds of gallons of napalm into cave openings. The result was infernos that destroyed everything inside enclosed spaces. The psychological effect on Japanese defenders was profound and immediate. Multiple Marine commanders stated after the battle that flamethrower tanks were the single most effective weapon system used on Iwo Jima. Their impact was undeniable and decisive. Captain Frank Caldwell commanded Company C of the 26th Marines. He stated bluntly that, in his professional view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting weapon that won the battle. His assessment carried significant weight among military planners. But tanks couldn't replace man-portable flamethrowers completely. The island's terrain presented significant limitations. Ravines honeycombed the landscape. Steep slopes blocked vehicle access. Natural and man-made obstacles limited tank mobility severely. Many Japanese positions were accessible only on foot. Caves with narrow entrances couldn't be engaged by tank-mounted systems. Pillboxes and defilade were hidden in draws and reverse slopes. These positions were beyond reach of mechanized flamethrowers completely. Despite tank introduction, the need for operators carrying portable M2 units remained absolutely critical. Infantry had to go where tanks couldn't follow. The operators continued to advance into deadly positions. They continued to die at appalling rates. By the battle's end on March 26th, the casualty figures told a story of unprecedented violence. 36 days of continuous combat had produced staggering losses. Marine casualties totaled approximately 24,000 men. Nearly 7,000 were killed in action, or died of wounds, or were missing and presumed dead. Roughly 1 Marine or Navy corpsman became a casualty for every 3 men who landed on the beaches. This was the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. Casualties exceeded those at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam combined. It was the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. The numbers testified to General Kurebayashi's defensive genius. His willingness to sacrifice every man in his command to inflict maximum American losses had worked exactly as planned. The strategy was brutally effective. Of approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died in their positions. Many were incinerated by flamethrowers in underground tunnels. Others were buried alive when their tunnel systems were collapsed by explosives. Still others were killed in final desperate fighting. General Kurebayashi himself was believed killed in action during a final counterattack on March 26th. His body was never definitively identified among the dead. His strategy of defense in depth and attrition warfare had worked exactly as intended. His refusal to waste men in traditional banzai charges had maximized American casualties. He had made America bleed profusely for every yard of ground. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima. This was more than any other single battle in American military history. 12 of these were specifically for actions involving elimination of enemy positions. This was the kind of close-quarters fighting where flamethrowers proved absolutely essential. Only 6 of those 12 recipients survived to receive their medals in person. The others died in the very actions for which they were being recognized. The mathematics of heroism were as unforgiving as the mathematics of combat. Woody Williams received his Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman in October 1945. He was the last living Medal of Honor recipient from World War II when he died in 2022 at age 98. His longevity was remarkable given his combat experiences. For decades after the war, Williams struggled with post-traumatic stress. He was haunted by faces of men he had killed. The screams of Japanese soldiers dying in flame echoed in his nightmares. Memories of friends who died beside him tormented his sleep. It wasn't until 1962, when he experienced a religious renewal, that his nightmares finally ended. Peace came through faith after 17 years of psychological torment. He spent the rest of his life working with veterans organizations. He established the Herschel Woody Williams Medal of Honor Foundation. He spoke frequently about the true costs of warfare. Joseph Rybukiewicz survived Iwo Jima, but carried physical and psychological scars for his entire life. The hand wounded by grenade shrapnel never fully healed properly. Nerve damage caused permanent problems, but more difficult were the psychological burdens he carried. He kept a photograph of a Japanese soldier's wife and children. The picture had been taken from an enemy soldier he had killed. He also kept the soldier's medical kit and bayonet as souvenirs. These items bothered him throughout his entire life. Before his death, he asked his wife to try returning the items to Japanese authorities. It was a futile attempt to make amends for what he had done as a flamethrower operator. The Japanese consulate in San Francisco showed little interest in his gesture. Rybukiewicz wrestled constantly with the moral weight of his combat actions. In the caves, especially toward the end when Japanese soldiers were running out of ammunition, you never knew how many people were hiding inside. There might be women taking shelter. Elderly civilians could be present, perhaps even children pressed into service as the situation became desperate. The flamethrower didn't discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. It killed everyone in an enclosed space without distinction. Fire consumed oxygen regardless of who was breathing it. Heat was lethal regardless of military status. The 92% casualty rate among flamethrower operators in one battalion on Iwo Jima represents perhaps the highest casualty rate for any specialized military unit in American military history. The comparison with other units was stark and sobering. Rifle platoons on Iwo Jima sustained approximately 33% casualties across the entire battle. Artillery units positioned behind front lines suffered far lower casualty rates. Even tank crews, despite vulnerability of their vehicles to Japanese anti-tank weapons, had casualty rates significantly lower than infantry units. Only flamethrower operators faced near certain casualty status. The mathematical probability of survival was negligible. Every day brought fresh confirmation of this brutal reality. The 4-minute average combat lifespan calculation remains controversial among military historians for its methodology. But it captured a truth that operators understood instinctively from their first day of combat. Every time they engaged a target, they were rolling dice weighted heavily against survival. The question naturally arises among students of military history: why volunteer for such duty? Given the appalling casualty rates, why would any Marine accept assignment to flamethrower operations? The answers were complex and varied significantly by individual circumstances. Some, like Joseph Rybukiewicz, volunteered for combat duty out of idealism and patriotism. They weren't initially realizing what specific duties they were volunteering for until they reached flamethrower school. The training revealed the true nature of their assignment. Others were assigned based on physical characteristics deemed suitable. The ideal flamethrower operator was large and strong enough to carry 70 pounds of equipment in addition to basic combat loads. Physical size became a selection criteria. Corporal Womack was described by his comrades as big and husky. He was popular with troops precisely because he could carry the flamethrower into combat when others couldn't manage the crushing weight. Size meant survival for the unit, if not the individual. Some volunteers recognized the critical importance of the weapon system. Marines who had witnessed friends die attacking pillboxes without adequate fire support understood that flamethrowers saved lives. Ironically, they saved lives by being devastatingly effective at taking lives. Others continued operating flamethrowers despite horrific casualty rates because of unit cohesion and responsibility to comrades. When your squad was pinned down by enemy fire, when friends were dying around you, when the only way forward required destroying an enemy position, operators picked up flamethrowers and advanced into certain danger. Private First Class Rudy Ortiz exemplified this spirit perfectly. His Medal of Honor citation noted he had no previous experience as a flamethrower operator. He repeatedly volunteered after 2 trained operators became casualties. He carried the weapon through murderous enemy fire multiple times. He helped destroy 10 Japanese pillboxes before being killed on March 1st, while attempting to extract his company from heavy enemy barrage. Ortiz wasn't trained for the assignment. He wasn't officially assigned to flamethrower duty. He volunteered because his fellow Marines needed him desperately. The strategic value of Iwo Jima itself remains heavily debated among military historians and strategic analysts. The official military justification emphasized several key factors. Removing the Japanese early warning system was considered crucial. Eliminating Japanese fighter harassment of B-29 bombing missions was important. Establishing emergency landing facilities seemed necessary. Post-war analysis noted that over 2,200 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima during the remainder of the war. This potentially saved 24,000 aircrew lives, according to official calculations. The numbers seem to justify the terrible cost in marine casualties. However, revisionist historians like Captain Robert Burrell challenged these statistical claims. He argued many landings were routine refueling stops rather than genuine emergencies. The life-saving calculations were inflated according to his analysis. Marines who bore the casualties hadn't been consulted about planning decisions based on debatable strategic calculations. What remains undeniable is that the battle fundamentally shaped American military planning going forward. The horrific casualty figures convinced military planners that invasion of mainland Japan would be catastrophically expensive in human lives. Casualty estimates for Operation Downfall ranged dramatically. The planned invasion of Japanese home islands carried projections from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American casualties. These numbers were based partly on Iwo Jima experience. The ferocity of Japanese resistance on the island, where defenders fought virtually to the last man, suggested that resistance on main islands would be even more fanatical. The casualties at Iwo Jima, combined with the even bloodier Battle of Okinawa that followed, helped convince President Truman that using atomic weapons to force Japanese surrender would paradoxically save lives by making invasion unnecessary. The logic was based on comparative casualty projections. For flamethrower operators who survived the battle life after Iwo Jima proved extraordinarily challenging. The psychological trauma was profound and lasting. Woody Williams spoke of putting memories in deep recesses of his mind. He acknowledged that any time you take a human life, there's psychological aftermath if you possess any heart at all. The nature of flamethrower killing was particularly haunting for survivors. Riflemen could sometimes distance themselves psychologically from their victims. Artillery crews might never see direct effects of their fire on human targets. But flamethrower operators witnessed everything in graphic detail. They heard the screams of burning enemies. They smelled burning human flesh. They witnessed enemies attempting to escape flames while engulfed in fire. They watched human beings thrashing in agony until death provided release from suffering. The psychological burden of inflicting such horrific death, even on enemies committed to killing you, was enormous and lasting. Many operators like Rybukiewicz kept souvenirs from enemy dead. They then spent decades troubled by these concrete reminders of human beings they had destroyed. The photograph of a Japanese soldier's wife and children was a particularly cruel memento. It reminded Rybukiewicz daily that every enemy he killed had been fully human. Each possessed families and loved ones. Each had been someone's husband or father or son. The personal cost of war became unbearably real. The cave fighting presented additional moral ambiguity that haunted survivors. Operators couldn't always know who was inside cave systems when they engaged entrances with flame. Japanese military personnel were certainly present, but also potentially Korean laborers pressed into service. Okinawan civilians might have taken shelter in fortifications. The flamethrower killed indiscriminately. Fire consumed oxygen regardless of who was breathing it. Heat was lethal, regardless of civilian or military status. Moral certainty became impossible in such circumstances. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not formally recognized or diagnosed for decades after World War II, affected flamethrower operators disproportionately. The combination of factors was devastating. Extended exposure to combat stress was compounded by the intimate nature of flamethrower killing. Survivor guilt over fallen comrades added another layer of psychological damage. The moral weight of their actions created burdens that manifested in nightmares, depression, substance abuse, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life. Many operators didn't speak about their experiences for decades after the war. When they finally did speak, often in old age, the memories remained vivid and painful. Time had not diminished the psychological impact. The images and sounds and smells remained as fresh as the day they occurred. The legacy of Iwo Jima fundamentally shaped Marine Corps doctrine going forward into the post-war era. The battle validated combined arms operations that integrated infantry, armor, artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support. Coordination between these elements had proven essential for success. It demonstrated the critical importance of specialized weapons, particularly flamethrowers, for reducing heavily fortified positions. No other weapon system had proven as effective against Japanese underground fortifications. The lesson was incorporated into training and doctrine. General Kuribayashi's defensive tactics influenced not just Japanese military thinking, but American understanding of how determined defenders could exact terrible costs even in hopeless tactical situations. The lessons of Iwo Jima were studied by military planners worldwide. They influenced defensive doctrines from Cold War planning through modern counterinsurgency operations. The Marine Corps War Memorial near Arlington National Cemetery was dedicated in 1954. It depicts Joe Rosenthal's famous photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. The bronze statue has become synonymous with Marine Corps courage, sacrifice, and ultimate victory. Yet of the 6 men depicted raising the American flag in that historic photograph, 3 died on Iwo Jima before the battle ended. Franklin Sousley was killed by sniper fire on March 21st. Harlan Block was killed by mortar fire on March 1st. Michael Strank was killed by Marine artillery fire also on March 1st. The monument honors all Marines who served, but it carries particular resonance for those who fought and died on Iwo Jima. The symbolism is both inspirational and tragic. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz spoke at the dedication ceremony for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Division cemeteries on Iwo Jima in March 1945. He stated words that have echoed through Marine Corps history ever since. Among the men who fought on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. That extraordinary valor was demonstrated most starkly by the flamethrower operators. They advanced into certain danger to protect their comrades and accomplish their missions. They understood that 92% casualty rates meant survival was mathematically unlikely. They picked up their weapons and advanced anyway. They did so because their brothers in arms needed them desperately, because the mission demanded their sacrifice, because someone had to carry fire into the enemy positions, because duty required it regardless of personal cost. The 70-pound flamethrower with its 7 seconds of burn time and 20-meter effective range was the most effective weapon Marines possessed for neutralizing Japanese fortifications on Iwo Jima. It was simultaneously the most dangerous assignment in the most dangerous battle in Marine Corps history. The men who carried these weapons paid the ultimate price. Of the operators deployed, an overwhelming majority became casualties. Those who survived carried physical and psychological scars for the remainder of their lives. Those who died were often unidentifiable, burned beyond recognition, buried in mass graves, or simply listed as missing in action when their bodies couldn't be recovered. Today, Iwo Jima has been returned to Japanese administrative control. It's officially known as Iwo II, which represents a correction of the name that acknowledges proper Japanese pronunciation. The island remains minimally inhabited and is used primarily as a self-defense force military base. It remains off-limits to casual visitors. The extensive tunnel systems and concrete fortifications remain largely intact. They're slowly crumbling with age, but still clearly visible. The beaches where Marines landed are essentially unchanged from 1945. They're still covered in distinctive dark volcanic ash. Every year on the anniversary of the February 19th landing, veterans who can still make the difficult journey return to the island. They are fewer each passing year, as the youngest survivors now approach 100 years of age. They gather on those historic beaches. They stand before memorials to fallen comrades. They remember. Woody Williams, before his death in 2022, made dozens of trips back to Iwo Jima. He met with Japanese veterans who were former enemies that remembered the battle from the defending side. These meetings were called reunions of honor. They brought together elderly men who had tried to kill each other decades earlier. Williams spoke at one such reunion, describing how Americans came to Iwo Jima as enemies but left as students. They had learned profound lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the true costs of warfare. Former enemies had become sources of mutual understanding. The flamethrower operators of Iwo Jima represented the full spectrum of American society. They were volunteers and draftees, farm boys and city kids, college students and factory workers. They were ordinary Americans thrust into extraordinary circumstances by global war. They trained for weeks to master a weapon that would statistically kill them. They advanced into concentrated enemy fire, carrying 70 pounds of fuel and explosives on their backs. They were marked by brilliant orange flame that announced their presence to every enemy soldier. They destroyed fortified positions that threatened their fellow Marines. 92% of them in one battalion became casualties in this process. Their story reveals the brutal mathematical reality of specialized warfare during World War II. The military leadership understood the risks completely. The individual operators understood the risks. Yet the weapons were so devastatingly effective, so absolutely essential to mission accomplishment, that the terrible human cost was deemed necessary. This represented the harsh calculus of warfare, where some lives are deliberately spent to save others, where individual sacrifice serves larger strategic objectives, where the mission demands that some walk directly into enemy fire so that others might survive to fight another day. The final mathematics of Iwo Jima were unforgiving in their brutal simplicity. 7,000 Americans killed in action, 20,000 wounded in action, 21,000 Japanese killed with virtually no survivors, an 8-square-mile volcanic island purchased at the cost of more than 27,000 American casualties and near total Japanese casualties. Among those American casualties, the flamethrower operators suffered the highest proportional losses of any specialized unit type. They were the spear tip of the spear tip. The most vulnerable troops in the most vulnerable positions of the most brutal battle in Marine Corps history. 79 years later, as the final veterans of that epic battle pass into history, their legacy endures in multiple forms. The Marine Corps War Memorial stands proudly in Arlington, Virginia. The names of the dead are inscribed permanently in stone at military cemeteries. Medal of Honor citations tell stories of extraordinary individual courage under impossible circumstances. But behind those official citations, those solemn memorials, those stark statistics were individual human beings. They were young men who carried fire into battle knowing it would likely kill them. They died at rates that stagger the imagination of modern military planners. They volunteered or were assigned to the most statistically dangerous duty in American military history. They fulfilled that duty, even though statistical analysis predicted it would kill them. The question of why 92% of flamethrower operators became casualties on Iwo Jima has a straightforward, tactical answer. Their weapon, while devastatingly effective against fortified positions, required complete vulnerability at close range to enemy positions. These positions were defended by determined soldiers who recognized flamethrower operators as priority targets and concentrated their fire accordingly. But the deeper human question endures through the decades. Why did they continue? Joseph Rybukiewicz returned to combat after treating his wounded hand. Woody Williams crawled forward 5 separate times to reload and re-engage enemy positions. Rudy Ortiz, untrained in flamethrower operations, repeatedly volunteered when trained operators became casualties. The answer lies not in military tactical doctrine or strategic necessity. It lies in the unbreakable bonds between Marines in combat, in the absolute unwillingness to let comrades die when you might save them, in the recognition that duty sometimes requires complete self-sacrifice, in the moral courage to act when acting means almost certainly dying. These men were not suicidal individuals seeking death. They were not unaware of the extreme dangers they faced. They were fully conscious of the mathematical risks and advanced into enemy fire anyway. That represents neither foolishness nor ignorance of battlefield realities. That represents courage in its purest and most distilled form. The willingness to accept terrible personal risk for a cause larger than individual self-preservation. The commitment to mission and comrades that transcends rational calculation of survival probability. The 92% casualty rate among flamethrower operators on Iwo Jima stands as permanent testimony to both that extraordinary courage and its devastating human cost. They walked deliberately into fire knowing most would not walk out. They did it anyway because duty demanded it. That is why they became casualties. That is why they are remembered with honor.